Tervetuloa tämänkertaisen Israel nyt podcastin pariin. Minä olen Pasi Turunen, Patmos-lähetyssäätiön toiminnanjohtaja, ja tämänkin kertaisen jakson sinulle tarjoaa Patmos-lähetyssäätiö. Tänään vieraanani on Eylon Levy. Levy on työskennellyt Israelin uutismediassa useita vuosia, kunnes vuonna 2021 Israelin presidentti Isaac Herzog nimitti hänet kansainväliseksi medianeuvonantajakseen Israelin presidentin kansliaan. Vuonna 2023 lokakuussa tapahtuneen Hamasin hyökkäyksen ja siitä alkaneen sodan jälkeen Eylon Levystä tuli Israelin hallituksen virallinen tiedottaja ja yksi Israelin kansainvälisesti tunnetuimmista kasvoista sodassa. Kun tämä työ päättyi Israelin valtion tiedottajana, Levy perusti itsenäisen Israeli Citizen Spokesperson Office-ryhmän, joka pyrkii välittämään totuudenmukaista tietoa Israelista ja taistelemaan mediassa leviäviä valheita vastaan. Laitan tämän ryhmän linkin tänne videon tietoihin tuonne alle. Minulla on ilo ja etuoikeus siis tässä jaksossa pitää häntä vieraanani. Tavoitin hänet Israelista ja me keskustelemme siitä, miten taistelua käydään Israelista myös mediassa ja uutismaailmassa. Tervetuloa mukaan tämänkertaisen Israel nyt podcastin pariin. So, Eylon Levy, really happy to have you with me in this episode of Israel Now. Thank you for your time. Before we jump into this subject about combating false media narrative, whole world is waiting and holding their breath for the threats that Iran has made. Could you share briefly about what are your thoughts on that situation?
The world could be a very different place by the time that you edit and post this podcast. For now, Israel has been preparing itself for the last 5 days for an immediate Iranian attack. Since October 7th, we have been at war with an Iranian proxy army in Gaza, Hamas, which invaded by air, land, and sea and took hostages on October 7th. But Hamas wasn't alone. The following day, another Iranian proxy army, Hezbollah in Lebanon, joined the war. They've fired around 7,000 rockets and drones at Israel and displaced tens of thousands of Israelis. And then a week later, the Houthi Islamic pirates in Yemen, another Iranian proxy group, joined the war, and they've been firing ballistic missiles and drones at Israel. Add to that Palestinian terrorists in the West Bank backed by Iran, Iranian militias in Syria and Iraq, and a direct attack from Iran itself in April. Over 300 ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones. And what you have is a regional war already. It's a regional war that Iran's proxy army started, that Iran has been directing and funding, a regional war in which Iran and its proxy armies have been attacking Israel on 7 fronts. And Iran feels emboldened. It feels emboldened because after the last time it attacked Israel directly, the world pressured Israel not to respond, to show restraint. And that means that we're now expecting Iran's response to be even bigger and badder than last time. Potentially more fronts, more targets, more rockets spread over more days. And Iran is openly vowing that it will commit war crimes. Iran's diplomats have said that their proxy army in Lebanon, Hezbollah, will target civilians on purpose. They've said they will not limit themselves to military targets, not that they have been limiting themselves to military targets. They've rained hellfire on the whole north of Israel. As we're speaking now, there are sirens going off in Acre, just north of Haifa. So Israel is preparing itself and hoping that the international community puts up a strong military deterrent to Iran. And as President Biden said last night, will make the necessary preparations to support Israel if and when the Islamic Republic decides to attack.
Right. But it sounds that the talk about avoiding escalation is not really a good description of the situation, because Iran has already escalated the situation.
Exactly. An Iranian proxy army, Hamas, declared war on Israel on October 7th. That was an escalation. when they brutally murdered 1,200 people, burned whole families alive, committed acts of gang rape, took 251 hostages. That was an escalation. Hezbollah joining the war on the side of Iran, that was an escalation. The Houthi Islamic pirates joining the war, that was an escalation. The rocket and drone attacks from Syria and from Iraq, that was an escalation. Talks with the Taliban to get them to join the war against Israel, that was an escalation. Iran has been escalating and escalating this conflict because its goal is to destroy Israel. And it's very clear about it. It really means it. Its goal is to surround Israel with a ring of fire and watch it burn. And Israel has been putting out fires. It's been killing the arsonists. And Iran doesn't like the fact that Israel has been targeting its pyromaniacs who have been trying to set the region on fire. And Israel has been trying to de-escalate the situation by repeatedly warning Hezbollah in the north, back off or we will have to push you away. As a government spokesman, I was saying this right in the first days of the war, where 10 months later, back off, stop attacking Israeli communities, or we will have to push you away. But if they're going to keep escalating and firing deadlier rockets and heavier rockets, more intense barrages deeper into Israel, at some point Israel is going to have to push back against a persistent Iranian escalation. And so if we're going to be talking in this episode about information and the media war, I read an extraordinary story in the New York Times just the other day that said that Iran was struggling to prevent itself getting dragged into a regional war, which is surreal because Iran is waging a regional war through its proxy armies. That's why it's funded them to the teeth and surrounded Israel with these proxy armies in order to use them. We are already in an escalation, and the world needs to put up a strong threat against Iran to back down and cease its aggression, or its escalations are only going to continue.
Right. As you mentioned, the Gaza war is already going on in its 10th month, which is a sad situation, of course. The battle is raging on the ground, under the ground, but also in the media. And this is why I'm so glad to have you, because I know that you have very extensive expertise and experience in the media. You worked in the media for many years, then as a Israeli government spokesman, and since you have launched this new group, Israeli Citizen Spokesperson Office. How does your work as an Israeli government spokesman differ from, or how your current work differs from what you used to do before? Are you freer to talk now about the issues?
Yeah, definitely. I'm freer to talk and share personal opinions, which I couldn't do when I was speaking for the State of Israel. But of course, it's much harder to share Israel's story and its side of the narrative when you are not official, because you will no longer be quoted automatically by media outlets around the world as speaking for the state. You are an analyst. You have expertise, you have experience, you have connections and insights to bring to the table, but don't speak with the authority anymore of the state, which is frustrating for me, but gives me an opportunity to try to build on my experience. And what I'm doing with the Citizen Spokesperson's Office is to build a team of ordinary citizens who will be able to put on a suit and tie and go in front of the cameras and explain Israel to the world. And this is apart from the question of whether Israel is doing a good job or a bad job explaining itself. I don't want to get into that right now. The fact is that the media war is a front in this war, because Iran, the Palestinians, their supporters are trying to poison global public opinion against Israel. Why? Because that will make it easier for them to attack Israel. When Iran attacked Israel last time, the US, the UK came to its defense and they sent warplanes to shoot down Iranian rockets. Iran wants to convince the West that Israel is this evil, genocidal, baby-killing, apartheid, starvation regime, so that when it attacks Israel, good, ordinary people in the West will say we should step aside and let the Jews have it because they had it coming. That's why the information war is so important, and why it is critical to hit back against the lies that are being told about Israel, because it is part of a deliberate strategy to poison global public opinion, to convince the West to throw its ally Israel under a bus and abandon it in a way that is only going to weaken the security of the West and the free world. So we're saying we're going to build a team of people who are going to explain Israel to the world, set the record straight, correct the narrative, strike down the lies, so that Iran cannot poison global public opinion against Israel and jeopardize not only our lives, which is what we care about at the moment, but also the security and prosperity of the whole free world.
Wonderful. And I keep recommending to all my friends your Israel citizen spokesperson office, because it's a really a very valuable resource. Thank you for what your team is doing. But I think here we come to this.
That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to provide a resource that will be useful for Israel supporters around the world, because we know that there are many people who are afraid to speak up because the other side is being very violent and intimidating and threatening people. But people want to speak up for Israel and for this Western alliance, and we're trying to give them the tools and the words and the information to do it. So I'm very glad that's useful for you.
Yes. Now, touching on something that you just mentioned, actually, this comes to it. There tends to be some kind of, at least I'm sensing when I'm watching the news and how the news media, even here in Finland and internationally, are making news about Israel, is that there tends to be a general inclination to automatically believe anything Hamas or enemies of Israel say, and automatically disbelieve everything that Israel is saying because, well, it's a government who is saying that, or it's an Israeli view or something like that. How would you, what kind of thoughts you have on that, and how could we break this cycle of this asymmetrical warfare in the media?
Yeah, it's staggering. I mean, the Hamas terror regime committed a brutal massacre of innocents, abducted hostages, went back into the Gaza Strip, and the first thing it did was deny that it did it. The second thing it did was promise to do it again and again until there is no more Israel. And then it kept sending out press releases to the world that the media took seriously and quoted as Palestinian health officials. I keep getting back to the story of October 16th, when Hamas put out a press release claiming that an Israeli airstrike had bombed a hospital, flattened the building, and killed 500 people. And it turned out it was an Islamic Jihad rocket that misfired from inside the Gaza Strip, hit the car park, killed maybe dozens of people, but by then the lie had gone all the way around the world. There is a persistent willingness to automatically believe whatever the jihadi death cult that did October 7th is telling the world media, and disbelieve what Israel is saying. Now, I think people should be skeptical of what any government or what any army is saying. You should check it, okay? That's what journalists need to do. They should not take any government's word at face value. But you definitely should not take the word of a jihadi death cult and terrorist group at face value either. We expect to see more serious scrutiny. Just take the casualty numbers that Hamas puts forward. Even the AP has said that the daily figures Hamas is putting forward are plainly inconsistent with the total death toll, and that those numbers are not reliable. Those numbers still include the 471 people Hamas claims were killed in the rocket strike that never happened on the Al-Ahli hospital, okay? That overall number includes the people who either were not killed because the death toll was much lower, or were killed because Islamic Jihad misfired a rocket, and it's definitely not our fault. So we expect greater scrutiny because the truth matters, and you should not take the word of a terrorist organization. And that is exactly what the media do every time they quote Palestinian health officials. They are quoting Hamas, the same Hamas that perpetrated the October 7th massacre and has been lying about it every day since then while promising to do it again and again.
Right, and now even United Nations halved their casualty figures pertaining to women and children. Actually,
the numbers changed dramatically as soon as the numbers changed dramatically as soon as they went from taking the headline figure that was, even Hamas says, was based on media reports, and moved to actually identified fatalities, and the percentage that they claim were women and children also dropped. And we know that Hamas has been passing off 19-year-olds as it's been massaging the figures to present them as children, and that many of those children will have been involved in military activities on behalf of Hamas as child soldiers, and many of the others will have been deliberately placed in harm's way because Hamas uses civilians not only as human shields, but as human sacrifices. There has to be more scrutiny. And just look at the story of UNRWA, okay? The Palestinians' own bespoke refugee agency that exists for the purpose of brainwashing Palestinian children to embrace jihad and reject peace. Israel said that many of its members took part in the October 7th massacre. And we were made out to be liars and fantasists, and people said it was false and it never happened. And yesterday, the UN admitted at least 9 UNRWA members took part in the October 7th massacre. At least 9 employees of a UN agency took part in the October 7th massacre. It's worse than that. It's true that most UNRWA employees did not take part in the October 7th massacre, and it's true that most of those who took part in the October 7th massacre were not UNRWA staff. But most of them were UNRWA graduates, because UNRWA teaches and educates about 90% of the adults and children in Gaza. And that means that 90% of the monsters who invaded Israel to behead people, commit gang rape, and burn families alive on October 7th went through the UNRWA education system. And yet you have the same agency that was the school system that produced the October 7th monsters keeps getting quoted by the international media as if it is some neutral neutral observer, some kind of Swedish peace force, instead of recognizing that it is a Palestinian organization run by Palestinians that indoctrinates children and produced the monsters who perpetrated the atrocities of October 7th. But people don't make the connection because they see that it has UN in its name, and that gives it moral authority. No, it doesn't. It doesn't even give it factual authority.
Right. Now, why, in your opinion, why does the Hamas media strategy work so well? And why do the Western media believe so easily? Are they ignorant of the true situation, or are they just mean?
It's an excellent question. There is a lot of ignorance, but I think the answer is more sinister than that. Hamas knows that large sections of global public opinion are already primed to automatically believe the worst about Israel and the Jews. And with every blood libel, every fake atrocity, every massacre that never happened, every allegation about humanitarian aid based on made-up numbers, they prime more and more people to automatically believe the worst about Israel. And you simply cannot disconnect this from centuries of anti-Semitism in these countries. I'm sorry. If these countries have a long tradition of blood libels against the Jews, it doesn't surprise me when they're automatically receptive to blood libels against the Jewish state. I think there is also a dynamic of wanting to support the underdog, of being on the side of the powerless against the powerful, and they buy into this fake narrative that sees the Hamas terror regime as the underdog and the powerless, standing up to the democratic state of Israel as the oppressor. And if you take that lens and you think that your job as a journalist is to speak truth to power, then you will be more critical of the side you regard as powerful. Now, I think it's a wrong lens. I think Israel is powerful. It's also intensely vulnerable because we're being attacked across 7 fronts right now by the Islamic Republic of Iran and its proxy armies. But it's also a basic dereliction of journalistic duty not to do proper fact-checking and not to wait for information to come to light. And you saw this with what happened with the Al-Ahli hospital incident, when it was a piece of Islamic Jihad rocket that hit the hospital and not a rocket strike. Instead of saying, we just got a press release from the terror organization that perpetrated a deadly terror attack 9 days ago, we're going to check the facts and get back to you when we have a clearer picture. The media went into breaking news cycle based on nothing more than the word of Hamas. It literally caused riots. There was destruction of property and people's lives were put at risk because of this irresponsible reporting and a desire to get ahead of the story instead of actually checking the facts. And so I expect more responsibility from the media in understanding that they are not only reporting on a story, they are also shaping the narrative. And in shaping the narrative, they are making a material difference to the way that this war is being fought between the democratic state of Israel and the fundamentalist Islamic regime and its proxy armies on 7 fronts.
So well put. And what I've tried to tell here for our audiences also is that remind them that there is no press freedom in Gaza. Lots of journalists their day job is a journalism and the night job is terrorism, as we have seen. And it just baffles me why the media is producing this one-sided narrative. I said to our viewers once that I've been thinking many times.
Yeah, by the way, I think that
Go ahead.
I think they have this own dilemma and they recognize it themselves, because when the media calls for independent access for international media into Gaza, and let's put to one side that even if we bring in European and American teams from BBC and Sky News, they will not have free access in Gaza, because if they're in an area controlled by Hamas, Hamas will control what they can broadcast. But when they demand that international teams come in, they're admitting that their teams on the ground are not really independent, okay? No journalist in Gaza, none of the journalists who their colleagues praise as being brave and fearless, have ever produced a single headline, not one, not a single image that has been inconvenient to the Hamas terror regime and embarrassed it. Not one image of a dead fighter being dragged out of the rubble, not one image of rockets being fired from inside civilian buildings, nothing. And that's because the so-called journalists operating in the Gaza Strip either work for Hamas media, Al-Aqsa TV, and then they are not journalists, they are Hamas content creators, or they work for a Qatari mouthpiece like Al Jazeera, and they are also terror operatives in Hamas's military wing, and the world falls for it, just like Ismail al-Ghul, who was on TV as an Al Jazeera reporter, but he was also an operative in Hamas's military wing, and took part in the October 7th massacre, and trained Nukba terrorists how to record their atrocities. And I don't care if he moonlights as a journalist and wears a press vest. It doesn't make him a journalist if he is a Hamas terror operative. But then even in the best case, you have people who will be openly sympathetic with Hamas because most of the people in the Gaza Strip are. That's what their own polling information tells us. Or in the best case, are simply cowed by Hamas and afraid to tell the full truth, even if they want to, because they know that they will be brutally beaten. And we've seen the images, social media coming out, less on traditional media, of Palestinians who have been beaten up by Hamas for resisting its regime. And everyone knows exactly what speaking out against that regime means. Definitely in this bizarre reality we live in, where people are pressuring Israel to end the war in a way that will leave the Hamas terror regime in power. So you have to be extremely skeptical about information coming out of the Gaza Strip, vet where it is coming from, whether these are really journalists, and if they are journalists and they're not content creators or actual Hamas military operatives, whether they're free to tell you the full story. And in Gaza, the answer is they're simply not.
Right. And not to mention the guy who was holding hostages in his house while writing newspaper stories about the Gaza war, who was also a Hamas fighter.
An Al Jazeera contributor, a reporter for the Palestine Chronicle, by the way, which is registered as a US 501c3p or whatever it's called. And one of the hostages, one of the captivity survivors, Almog Meir Jan, is now suing this US-based non-profit because one of its contributors held him as a hostage, and abused him in his home.
Yeah. There is also this blood libel about the famine in Gaza. When we talk about images, I've told our audiences here in Israel Now podcast that it cannot be true, the famine, because definitely Hamas would send images if there were children dying, as they should be dying in the famine area. But we don't see those pictures anymore.
No, of course not, because it's completely made up. Because since Hamas declared this war on October 7th, Israel has opened humanitarian aid routes into Gaza by air, land, and sea. Because hundreds of thousands of tons of aid have entered Gaza. Because there are now more food trucks entering Gaza than there were at any point before the war. According to the UN's own numbers, about 70 food trucks a day entered before the war. Now we're on 150, which more than compensates for the destruction of local farming as a consequence of the war that Hamas started. The markets are full, the prices have come down, and the UN has shifted the story, and its spokespeople now claim that actually there isn't enough cash in Gaza, and that's why people can't buy food. Why do they need cash to buy food if it's being sent in as humanitarian aid? Israel has a policy: get the trucks to the border, we will let all humanitarian aid go in. But there is a problem. Hamas has been hijacking aid. And Israel has been flooding Gaza with so much aid that the UN is drowning in it. And the UN has not been able to distribute that aid. And a lot of it has been simply rotting in the sun. Because Israel has been trying to get the UN to scale up its humanitarian aid efforts. And they haven't done it because it's always much easier to blame Israel. And I'll connect to what I was saying before. Because historically, it's much easier to scapegoat the Jews. And they understand exactly what mental strings they're pulling with that.
There has been also an international reaction to this war, actually some kind of a knee-jerk reaction to fall for the two-state solution. And I don't want to go into a politics of pros and cons of the two-state solution, but how would you assess that? What is the narrative behind this that nations rush to recognize an imaginary state which does not exist yet, as though it is something that could solve this war or bring it to an end?
States that are rushing to recognize a non-existent Palestinian state in response to October 7th are directly encouraging the next one. Because instead of telling Hamas terrorism doesn't work, they say you should look back at October 7th as a national holiday, a moment that propelled your national cause forward. When the governments of Ireland, Spain, and Norway recognize a non-existent Palestinian state, they are telling Hamas, burn more Jewish families, abduct more Jewish babies, rape more Jewish women. It will work. We will reward you for it. It's horrific, and they will have the blood of the next victims on their hands. But besides that, I think the international obsession with the two-state solution fails to take the Palestinians at their word and fails to give them proper respect. They're telling us what they want. From the river to the sea, with the sovereign state of Israel in the middle. They're not saying two states for two peoples, we want to live next to Israel. They're saying, give us from the river to 9 miles away from the sea so that we can sprint the remaining distance. Palestinians who talk about a two-state solution say, we want a state in the West Bank and Gaza called Palestine, and we want to flood Israel with millions of hostile immigrants until it has an Arab majority and changes its name to Palestine, and we're never going to give up on that right. And that means that it's not a two-state solution, it would be a two-state war. Two states would not end the conflict, it would aggravate it. Because if the Palestinians are saying that their goal is from the river to the sea, and Iran is saying that it will flood that region with weapons to support terrorists who want to destroy Israel, you are going to be advancing their forever war against Israel, instead of getting them to stand back. That's the horrific tragedy of well-meaning Europeans and others who want to solve this conflict, who do not understand or do not want to believe that when the Palestinians say, from the river to the sea, they actually mean it. That theirs is a forever war against Israel in any borders whatsoever. And until the Palestinians reconcile themselves with the existence of the state of Israel, there's nothing to talk about. By the way, that's also the perspective of many Israeli left-wingers who have always been stalwart advocates of the peace movement. I had Fania Oz on my podcast, the daughter of the great Israeli novelist Amos Oz. She believes in a two-state solution. She thinks eventually the Palestinians need a state. But she says it won't happen in a year. It won't happen in 5. It probably won't happen in the next 10. Because for that to happen, we need de-radicalization. We need them to give up their vision of destroying Israel from the river to the sea. And as much as she sees herself as an advocate of the peace movement, she says if the Palestinians are saying that if I give them more land, they're going to use it to try to kill me, obviously I would be insane to give them more land. And for Israelis after October 7th, it's especially surreal to hear the world talking about the need for more Israeli concessions. We had the October 7th massacre because we gave the Palestinians Gaza. In 2005, we withdrew from the Gaza Strip. We gave it to the Palestinians. We hoped they would turn it into the Singapore of the Middle East. But every time Israel withdraws from territory, it gets filled not by the forces of democracy, but by barbaric jihadi terrorists. It happened when we pulled out of cities in the West Bank, we got the Second Intifada. We pulled out of southern Lebanon, we got an Iranian proxy army, Hezbollah with 200,000 rockets. We pulled out of the Gaza Strip, and we got the October 7th massacre. We want peace. But in order for there to be peace, you need what the Prime Minister calls the 3 Ds. Destroy Hamas, demilitarize Gaza, and de-radicalize Palestinian society. Until they give up their vision of from the river to the sea, destroying Israel, and a forever war until that happens, it is going to be impossible to have peace, and we're going to be condemned, unfortunately, to further rounds of conflict. That's why anyone who wants to support peace in the Middle East needs to be looking not for Israeli concessions, but how to truly moderate the Palestinians and convince them that Israel is here for good and they should abandon their forever war against it.
For our last 4 or 5 minutes, Eylon, I would like to hear your thoughts on what can we do in this media battlefield, and what should we do? How should we do? In particular, I'm thinking that we who stand with Israel and try to bring the other voice, make the other voice heard, we often tend to be reactive and just combating the false narratives. But I think it's not enough just to be reactive. There should be a certain kind of, if I use, to be on offensive also. So how could we turn this battlefield the other way around?
First of all, I'll say thank you to anyone who is fighting this fight against the lies and the propaganda. It's not easy. The other side uses techniques of intimidation and violence, and people fear social ostracization, career suicide, even physical threats if they stand up for Israel, because they're trying to turn Israel into a symbol of evil and make sure no one wants to be identified with it. So if you are fighting that fight, it means you understand what is at stake. You understand what the enemies of the West are trying to do, how they are trying to weaken Europe by weakening and crippling their major ally in the Middle East, and how Israel's fight is a fight for humanity against the forces of barbarism and Islamic fundamentalism. So first of all, good job. It's really important to be part of the public discussion. The media war isn't just about fighting in the TV studios, and it's not just about calling in when there is a radio show talking about Israel, or writing a letter to the editor, or even posting social media content. It's being part of the conversation in the real world, in your workplaces, in your families, in your communities, in schools, at colleges. Whenever the issue comes up, being part of the public debate. Because if you're part of the public debate, that will make itself into media circles as well, because it's clear that there are differences of opinion, and you can change people's minds when you confront them with the facts. But it has to start there. People have to use their voices. I know it's dangerous, I know it's scary, but it has to be done, because we simply cannot afford to allow the lies that are being spread against Israel by the Islamic regime in Iran and by the Palestinian terror groups to become the baseline of common knowledge. Because this isn't just a war for the hostages and for Israel's freedom, it's a war about the truth and whether truth matters anymore. Or whether you're going to allow terrorists who committed the deadliest terror attack in world history after 9/11 to put out a press release and expect the UN and media to believe it automatically.
Right. Well, Eylon Levy, I really appreciate your time. Thank you for having this chat with you. And if you
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I have to say, it's been nearly 10 months since the war started. It's been over 300 days. I can't believe it's been so long that there are still 115 hostages trapped in Gaza. And somehow this is my first interview for Finland. So may it be the first of many.
Thank you. And I think for all of our viewers who are maybe, like you said, some people are afraid of what it costs to me to stand for Israel, I would say that now it's not time to be afraid of losing friends, but using your right to choose your friends properly, because this is the time we have to stand for the truth.
That's a privilege.
Thank you, Eylon, and all the best.
Okay. Thank you very much, Pasi. Thank you.